Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me today are Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, Mark McCaffrey, and assistant editor Murray Dahm. And as a change of the usual topics, we thought we'd discuss some ancient news because there is actually a lot of it out there all the time. We tend to look at our literary sources only, except in the next issue, Ancient Warfare, where we have a long article which combines history, geography, and some attempts at archaeology and see what gets us, what that gets us. And in this case, the answer is a bit disappointing, perhaps, but it's still an interesting exercise to go through. And Murray knows what I'm talking about.
No spoilers.
The usual last minute drama, but yeah, but archaeology does add a lot to what we know about the ancient world. The problem is always to try and fit what you find in the ground with the sources. The question, can you fit it? Can you do anything with it? Can it be combined with anything else at all? Or is it a reference to something that we didn't know about before? And what does that tell us? So there is a lot of news out there, and I think Murray stumbled on something that he specifically would like to discuss and see what that might be.
So it's been a very interesting month for ancient warfare in the sense that there've been a whole bunch, seemingly, of new discoveries that have been published or written about in more popular presses over the last month, which have remarkable. There's been a battlefield found very close to Vienna under a sports field in the suburbs of Vienna, which is about 10 kilometers from the fort of Vindobona. There's been a bridgehead, which is known as the Old Castle. Apparently for centuries is known as the Old Castle, and they've actually excavated it for the first time and discovered that it's a Marcus Aurelius era bridgehead over the Danube at Carnuntum, which is in Austria. There's a new Allan tomb from the Germanic tribe of the Allans. There's new finds, or at least new interpretations, at the Macedonian site at Vergina. There's the new discovery of the Bronze Age battlefield. It's amazing how many new discoveries in ancient Roman warfare there have been that have been published. And that's ignoring new discoveries in ancient history, which, are not necessarily militaristic in nature. It's been a very boon month for ancient warfare-related studies. I think the Carnuntum battlefield, or the Vienna battlefield, is probably the most interesting one, because it's a deposit of, they estimate, 150 bodies all just piled into this very small space. They're not cremated, which they should be in that period. They've been jumbled together. There are, in that jumble of body parts, there are several decapitated skeletons. There are Roman scales, Roman boots, one cheek piece from a helmet, and one pugio, which seems to date it to the late first, early second century AD, which is amazing as a find.
Yeah, and apart from the decapitations, I think a lot of the bones also show traces of violence. Like I think it was a vertebrae with a nice square hole in it, which suggested it was hit by Pelham, perhaps, or somebody else who invented a Botkin arrow. I follow that.
Oh, controversy. Yeah. So it's amazing because you've got this deposit found accidentally. It was under a sports field that was being renovated, and then I believe it was discovered in October 2024. So, they were published, and then the finds were displayed for the first time in late March, and that's what led to some articles on it. So it's very, very recent in terms of, ancient warfare. We were talking about things that are 2,500 years old and older. To have something that happened, only a couple of months ago is quite remarkable and really exciting, which is good. It's not a movie, not a movie exciting, people. It's the actual stuff in the ground. So now comes the interesting part of waiting for the publication and then the interpretation of that evidence, which is already started. But
and the official academic publication may also be a while.
How solid do you think it is that the skeletons are of Roman soldiers of a particular time period? Because I've heard late first century AD bandied about They were near Vindobona, which was at this time, I'll call it a fort, but maybe not as the sizable fortress it became later on. There were signs of violence. So it looks like they died in combat, but they were all placed in a mass grave. They were not cremated according to Roman custom at the time. Why, if you're going to speculate on the basis of the limited information that we have, what might you come up with?
Maybe it's useful to say something about how they can date any finds normally.
Well, the radiocarbon dating places them between 80 AD and 234 AD. So that's the span of the body remains. And I think from what we were talking, Jasper was talking about when we have the literary sources, that we think Vindobona is founded at some point in the 90s, maybe early hundreds, but there's very little to say then this is the date that it's founded. Whereas in some of the other Roman fort sites, we've got a much more secure foundation date. And so it's really interesting in terms of that span of dates, which is the radiocarbon, then narrowing it down for various reasons as to
and normally the ways you do that is maybe with coinage. If you find a coin, then that it cannot be earlier than when that coin was struck.
I didn't see any mention of any coinage.
No, there was no coinage.
No.
There was no. I think normally ceramics are a good way to. Good ceramic styles are very well known. And so if we only have the finds ourselves, then we have the radiocarbon dating, which gives you a pretty wide spread, and the actual items.
Let's imagine this is actually a sort of a hurried burial after some catastrophe. If it's done by the losing side in this case, they would probably want to retrieve some of the things so they could then recycle it. And certainly if it's war spoils, they're going to strip them of armor and money and all the rest of it. So to that extent, the fact that there are any things found, like a single cheek plate, some daggers or whatever, is quite remarkable. I mean, most battle sites, for what I can see from the evidence, don't have a lot of material deliberately because this stuff has value to the people who actually win the battle. So unfortunately, we are literally picking over bones.
I'm considering whether what it could represent, and once again, it's pure speculation, but what it could represent is that this was a civil war where the Romans fought Romans, and the losing side was given a burial because maybe they were actual Roman legionaries that had been defeated. So they were given a burial, but the great majority of their equipment was taken from them. Now, why was some equipment left behind? I think there was the Pugio dagger and maybe a handful of other things that might have been, worth taking. I don't know. But the fact that most of the equipment is gone would bespeak that this was, the equipment was valuable, but they got a burial anyway.
The initial, I think, historical interpretation is that somehow a conflict between Romans and Germans at the time of Domitian, so it's a sort of Domitianic period. So probably not civil war, but an assault by somebody maybe crossing the Danube at this point. And as a result of that, I mean, you've got Trajan in the area at some point, and Domitian has a war across the Rhine. I think, isn't it, to the Catti or something? But the point is, I think what this highlights is really, if we are relying solely on the extant written reports, we're going to be left wanting because they can't be relied upon to produce a complete chronology. I mean, my favorite bit is, I think, like book 53 or 55 of Cassius Dio, where he's talking about a lot of wars happened, too many to mention, moving on. And it's awful because you're thinking, you can't do this to me. I'm a military historian. What are you not telling me? And that man's writing like 1,000 years of history or something or other, and he's not paying attention to everything. So if you're trying as an historian to place an actual historical event to describe what you're finding in the ground, a lot of the time you're going to find it very frustrating because it's not documented in the way that we would know it. What's very interesting, I think, about a lot of these places. So, for example, we mentioned, I think, a fortress, the old fort, the Bridgehead Fort. There you've got mention of 2 legions. So we can narrow it down a little bit. You can actually say, okay, now we have a period, now we have some maybe identifiable units, and we can actually then understand some context of why there. Well, it makes sense. It's sort of a military outpost. It has views of a river that has some other story to it. The problem with the Vindobona and the bones is the bones have to somehow speak to us.
But they do in terms of, don't they, in terms of the ages that have been ascribed to them. They're talking about ages between 20 and 30, which seems to an interesting point in itself, that all male, but surely in terms of a legion, you'd have a little bit more of a range, maybe in terms of, pinning that down to that particular age range. That might help us to identify, or at least, speculate as to who or what situation we're talking about. Is there a particular recruitment period where there is a lack of recruitment, or then relying on younger troops that can help us pin that down?
Yeah. And I think it's one of the things that Lindsay's talking about, is that when we do have such limited literary sources for so much of this period, to then turn around and say this archaeological find relates to this one anecdote that we have surviving in the literary record. And you see it happening, it goes all the way back to Schliemann. I want to identify Troy as this place, therefore I will make my archaeology fit my literature. In some cases that works, and in other cases it doesn't. And in some cases the dating layer works, and in other cases it doesn't. But I think the interesting thing about these finds is, because they seem to radiocarbon date fit the foundation of Vindobona and therefore Vienna, there's been a magnetism towards that. Oh, this is the origins of our city, our modern city. And, it's the best evidence we've got of the foundation of Vindobona, therefore Vienna. And you're like, oh, hang on a bit, but there's no known record of any catastrophic defeat in this area, in any of these wars, Trajan's, Domitian's, in the region. Yes, there are wars against the Chatti. Yes, there are wars against the Dacians and various Germanic tribes, but nothing there. And so, the only catastrophe militarily dates to 170, which is, still within the radiocarbon date, but it's later than the Puggio design by about 60 years, which will maybe disclude it. And we don't have there's no inscriptional evidence, like there's not even a fragment. It'd be lovely if the cheek piece had what legion it came from, because again, like the bridgehead, we would be able to narrow down which legio it actually relates to.
Let me throw this into the mix. It'll be a bit controversial. And I covered this. I was talking about the Warwick presentation last June, wasn't it? Crikey, that's already a long time ago. So I've been doing the news for ancient warfare now since 2011, and I reckon I've done about 420 stories in that time, and a lot of them will be exactly as you've described them. A find here, a piece of wall, the bones are on the outside. That's part of a siege party, or, what was the manner of death? So there's a number of vectors here. One is that people need to understand things, and they do that through the means of telling stories. You try to understand something, you find a context, you find the narrative, and that becomes an orthodoxy until someone comes along and challenges it. We've seen that at Maiden Castle, right? Maiden Castle, I did an article years ago, I think actually in Ancient Warfare, where I tried to show how the theories of that had changed. So when Mortimer Wheeler excavated it with the Luftwaffe bombers flying overhead, he characterized it as gallant and valiant Britons fighting the Romans who were stomping up and bombarding the defenders there with ballista bolts. And now, in fact, what we see is, looking at the evidence with fresh eyes, in fact, they're not ballista bolts in the back of the bones of the but it's actually a spear point. And in fact, they probably don't date from a Roman invasion period. In fact, it doesn't even seem to be that may have even been attacked that way. And it wasn't probably in the way that we call them hill forts. It was like a hilltop, I don't know, supply dump, or a sort of place where you kept corn, and it had some maybe religious significance. So there's this element that you tell a story, and sometimes you can be very wrong about that story. There's another thing which I owe a debt to Jona Lendering, I think, who has this very strong point about the over-sensationalization of story. So interesting enough, the Zimmering story, which we've been talking about, the Carnuntum, in fact, it's the press source actually says Sensationsfund. It's being positioned as a sensational find. And over the years of writing this thing, I yawn because I'm thinking, okay, here we go again. And that what my job as the news guy is to peel back and say what actually is the evidence, as you've been talking about the pottery, the militaria, and so on, and just to take a cold hard look at some of these things. And I remember I was writing a story, and Jasper pointed this out. It was a little a find of a boat off the shore of, I think it was Alexandria, and the archaeologist said, "This is the first time we have found a trireme." And Jasper pointed out it's a flat bottom boat. Triremes aren't flat, but this is much more like the boat that they'd found in the Netherlands, which was just a little kind of a thing which went between ships to the shore. It was a stevedore kind of like, sort of thing. And I think there's a race to find the interpretation, which has an effect of unfortunately contaminating the story. That becomes the orthodoxy, and then when someone tries to challenge it, it's very hard for them to do it. It's essential work, however. So I understand that, and where Yona, I think, pointed out, the schools, the archaeologists, all the people involved in discovery and conservation are under immense pressure to get finance to continue the work. And what that injects into the conversation is an unhealthy alliance, which is we have to grab the attention of the media. We have to have this. It's more important than all the other people in order that our faculty, our discoveries are continued. And one thing that I think was you were mentioning earlier about we wait now for these story reports to be officially documented. The tragedy in all of this is we're still waiting in a great many cases for the official papers to be published because there's no money and there's no resources.
And also the official reports are far more mundane, far less sensational, actually don't bear out what was reported in the initial sensation. Oh, and a whole lot of painstaking years-long, decades-long work. We're still waiting on the translation of cuneiform tablets, which could change our understanding. Another news find only this week, I think, is the discovery of Egyptian pottery at Megiddo. And I think, coming to your point, when there is a story that is the mainstream story, and this is the narrative, a new find can either upset that apple cart and therefore change, and require people to relook at the evidence and go, actually, maybe we've been mistaken, this is wrong. Or the new evidence is immediately rejected and is therefore sidelined by the people who want to say, no, that doesn't relate. So, for instance, this finding of Egyptian pottery at Megiddo supports the idea in the 7th century, late 7th century BC. So it's the second Battle of Megiddo in 609 between Necho II and Josiah, the Judean king, which says the Egyptians did defeat Josiah there and then garrisoned Megiddo. And so it's like, okay, that's evidence of Egyptian presence because it's not expensive Egyptian pottery. It's cheap.
But the other thing that's interesting there, Murray, is that also this, and the way that some of the stories were presented was that Greeks were there. So I'm just going to read from the story as I wrote. With the Egyptian finds, archaeologists also uncovered Greek pottery dating from between 630 and 610 BC. Its significance is that it raises the possibility that Greek mercenaries fought alongside Egyptian troops. Textual evidence from Greek and Assyrian sources do indeed confirm that Egyptians hired foreign mercenaries at the time. In the context of Israel, that there is a sort of national fundament in archaeology to really ground it in the biblical story, right? There's always what we're striving always to find evidence of King David. And what's the fact when you read, for example, like the Times of Israel and so with this story, for example, covered, what you'll find is that they are eager to quote from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible.
Yes, always.
As
Yeah.
So I think again you have to understand the context of these things, but it just leapt out to me that Greeks were there too.
Yes, and also very liminal. So then they jump on to the interpretation, a very tangential interpretation of a name in the Old Testament who may have been a Lydian king. And therefore, if there's Lydian mercenaries, therefore there are Greek mercenaries. And it's funny having a much more stepped back approach of going, well, hang on, the actual dating of when mercenary forces, which we've covered in the magazine, that, 609 BC is a bit too early for Greek mercenaries, unless you identify the Greeks as the sea peoples. which again is a whole kettle of fish. And so that idea of like the hiring of and firing of mercenaries is a bit out. But again, pointing that out is a bump in the road of no, this is the narrative we want to drive, and therefore your historical context bump in our road, we will flatten you because you don't fit our narrative. Therefore,
exactly. But it's going back to what we were discussing, going back to the find in Vienna. It's just, you can fit the evidence almost any way. I mean, we found 150-ish skeletons with one cheek piece, three pieces of scale armor, a dagger, a sword, and a spear point that could be from anybody. So then based on that, they're Romans. We're just ignoring the fact that we know that Roman weapons have been found all throughout Scandinavia. They were just definitely traded. They may have been booty. Just latching on to what Mark just said, if they were legionaries, you'd kind of expect a few guys who were older, because there are plenty of legionaries in their 30s and officers might be older, and they weren't burnt, but just chucked in a grave. So maybe this was a big raiding party that attacked, was defeated. It's not a Roman calamity. It was just a raiding party that was beat back with heavy losses. And some of them maybe have had Roman stuff, or maybe there were some damaged Roman items that just sort of fell in the mix, and they were just quickly shoved aside and dirt over it, done. You have to keep an open mind because it all just can go anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that this is a singular find. Yes, it's amazing because it's 150. There's a lot to get through, but it's a single deposit. It's not, they need to find more. We need to dig up every sport field in Vienna and every empty lot. Absolutely. Just dig them all up, which is, I'm always surprised when I was traveling around England, and I think it was up in Wales, Segundinum, a Roman fort. And yes, and there's two houses built in the middle of this Roman fort at some point. And I'm like, I would just buy those, and then there would be tunnels out from my basement everywhere. But they would be illegal tunnels. But and if you live in one of those houses and have built those, I'm sorry, I've just dobbed you in. But that idea of finding out is seems to be undesirable. Don't we want to find out? And this idea of the sensationalism and pursuing the sensation rather than the incremental addition to our knowledge, and there's the antiquities scheme in Britain where metal detectorists report their findings, and you get a scale from here and a coin from here. And in a way that's unsensational, but in a way that's better archaeology, because it incrementally adds to our knowledge rather than looking for the singular spectacular find.
The great thing about that, Murray, is that you end up with a very large database, which then people can cross-reference and they can pattern recognize it. The other thing is also, and again, it's one of the joys of going back to the UK, and I just came back from there in the early part of last month, is to be able to watch that program with Alice Robinson, who does the Dig for Britain. And so she's the sort of celeb British archaeologist, and it's always interesting following different archaeologists as I do on X, Blue Sky, and Facebook, that they get to be on the show. I mean, they get to be able to celebrate their finds. And I think the one thing that's very healthy about that is that there is a sort of like a public awareness of the need to declare stuff they find, because it actually tells us history of Britain. That's one thing. The thing is also is that people now understand, I think, much better the process of how history is told through artifacts, and sometimes they're not always clear as to what they are. And people, I think, can live with that ambiguity. But what it adds up to, I think, is a very healthy public engagement with history. And of course, Time Team, I think we mentioned that somewhere, is the great example of how that really, I think, came together for several years. And the great news is that's actually, of course, now basically member funded, and they're doing the thing of Sutton Hoo.
But I would add, I was also going to add one thing actually to this. We tend to focus on the finds. What did they find? But of course, the archaeologists would say, the problem is as soon as you dig it up, you destroy the find context. And that can sometimes say a whole lot as well. But, how were they found? what was mixed in, what was on top, what was below it, what did the soil look like, and
Yeah,
that's
but
the
they haven't
problem with
reported
all
that
these
because it's not
potential
sensational.
finds. Now, but the problem, of course, with all these potential finds is that you have to dig it all up. You have to dig it up scientifically, and then you have to describe everything you found, in a way so that others, using databases such as Lindsay just mentioned.
One thing that I missed was why were they digging in a soccer field at all? What?
Because it was a commercial development. They were doing
Oh, okay.
and that rescue archaeology is how a lot of archaeology is found in Europe.
That's not all of it, but it's a very large majority, I think, of archaeology is because of construction work. Due to the Malta Treaty, they have to investigate if there's anything in the ground. And that's where money is, because the developers have to pay for it.
Yeah, those Pocklington finds, the Pocklington Shield and the four-horse chariots in Britain were found because they were like, what's a new housing estate? They're like, delayed. Curse you, Bronze Age finds, which is a problem because, of course, when you look at that responsibility and it's exciting for us, you can imagine the property developer is annoyed, angry because they lose their investment. They can't, build the housing as fast as they would. And there are other parts of the world, which will remain nameless, where they shunt those finds aside and destroy them so that they can build and get their cash out, which is, who knows what we've lost through that kind of rapacious, reference to rapax, rapacious building.
Where it works, I think, quite well in Britain is most of the developers that you get, or I get to see the press releases, are publicly traded companies. They're PLCs. So they have stakeholders and they have a press department and they have to carefully look after their image. And that's why they want to play ball, because they're relying on a flow of approvals for other planning applications they've got, and they'll continue to be able to do it. So everybody plays by the rules, the thing moves forward. I think you raise a very interesting point there, where people who are maybe not so principled get involved. And in fact, I think this is what we found in places like Pompeii recently, Reggio 9 and 5, I think it is, where the criminals were acting, right? They were digging tunnels, and in fact, they were intercepted. And a lot of these new finds are effectively an attempt to try and preserve what's been found and then document it the scientific way. Otherwise, it'd be lost. I mean, criminals would be selling the stuff on eBay.
Well, I was, this new Allen tomb, utterly undisturbed for 2,500 years, which is shocking people. It's like, no one's got to it. No looters have been there. No archaeologists have found it before. So those are exciting, and I think it's good that they're exciting. But yeah, the measured, rigorous reporting of what it actually all means is a painstaking and time involving process, rather than the sensational overturn of everything we understood in a moment, which is that's exciting, and that's what people sell their finds
that
as.
can come through at that secondary stage, though, in terms of, because I'm just sort of thinking as some of the Vindolanda tablets, in terms of, some of them that were churned up back in 2014, I think it was. Now, after looking at the databases, looking at the, very awful handwriting, and actually looking more at the text and going back and having a second analysis of what exactly is the text actually meaning, you've got new finds as such in terms of talking about slavery in the presence of a Roman camp, like at Vindolanda, and how that relationship is with the camp commander and how that compares to other camps across the empire. So I think that's an exciting find as such. It might not be a physical find, but it is an academic find.
But I think that's the interesting thing, is that that will take time to filter into people's understanding, because it changes, and therefore the books on it pre-2014 or pre-now when it's published have to alter. And if you're not thinking, oh, great, new edition, you're like, well, actually now that is all out of date, and you need to be on top of the latest research, which is useful. And Lindsay's fingers on the pulse, all 10 fingers on the pulse. But I think the interesting thing, I love the story. And coming back to Lindsay's point about stories, I bought the Vindolanda handbook in a secondhand bookshop from 1971. No Vindolanda tablets, because they hadn't been found yet. And then the next one, 1973, oh, the ventilator had, it's like, oh, wait, no, everything's changed. And the story of Eric Burley finding the first tablet, realizing what it was, and walking down the site, reading this tablet as it faded because it was oxidizing, is a really cool story of like, I'm holding in my hands a change in history. It's and then they have to view them under lab conditions, but that does happen. But I think it's really interesting how every find is now framed as that. The Virginia finds, new finds in Virginia. Are they new finds? Are they new interpretations of who was buried there? Oh wait, are we talking new, or are we just talking a new idea? Oh, hang on, what's new here? Nothing. Oh,
so Murray, to that exact point, what I try to do in the news is have a blend of things like actual finds, because they're very topical. They're very absolutely intriguing, and of course, sometimes the pictures they merit the word spectacular. I mean, seeing 150 interlaced bones and skeletons is just an image you will not easily forget. But on the other hand, some of them are papers. And to that point, that there are people interpreting things. And I think what's been very interesting tracking over the years is that we get different kinds of peer-reviewed papers. So there's PLOS One, and then there's Antiquity, and some of the other well-known publications like that. And not all of them are of equal quality. And the quality of the research in the papers is also not of equal quality. So I think what's good is that what we do in the magazine is we try and put, if we can have space, to put the QR code so people can go look at the papers. And I think it's very important that when people are looking at it, is to go back to the sources. I know we talk about ancient sources. For me, the sources are modern sources too. So, for example, I was just going to highlight to one thing about, we mentioned already Israel, but for example, one of the stories I hope will appear in the new issue will be the body of a 4,000-year-old Siberian identified as a warrior archer. The source is TASS of Russia. And what's really interesting, when you go to the site, and it's all, of course, in Russian, it's a very, very, very long story. And it is a story. What you're on is on a journey of discovery of the reporter. The reporter goes around to different people telling the story of the discovery. What I had to do was untangle all of that and pick out the facts and write what I would think is a news story. So if you go to tas.ru, Artika Segodnia, and a stream of numbers, you will actually be able to see this in Russian. You run it through Google Translate. You see what this is, and what that tells you is, why were the Russians doing that? Well, my interpretation is Russia needs a PR job right now, right? And what they're trying to show is they have a legit history all of their own, which goes way back. I mean, we're talking here 4,000 years ago, right? And this is an archer. His body armor is made of what I'm talking about. I think it's elk bones, and the shield is made of elk bones bound together. They found arrow heads in the bones. So he's clearly been in a combat situation. And I just want to encourage people, if they get the chance, when they read the stories in ancient warfare, try go back to the original press source. See the way they present the stories. A lot of stories that you'll see coming out from city councils are done with politics in mind. So, for example, what you'll have is a discussion of the find, and then the mayor talks, and then the head of the department here, and it's one after the Italians are pretty good at this, by the way. The soprintendenza of something, and some of these people have an eye to. So a little town in Italy or Spain or Portugal is trying to show we have a history too, and we're worth looking at. Come visit us. Increasingly in places like Turkey, what they're doing is they find somewhere, they say, hey, Alexander came through here. We'll make this a park. We'll make it a tourist attraction. A German example would be Kalkriese. So Kalkriese has been interpreted as being Teutoburg. Well, maybe they're a little bit more ambiguous about that now, because to be that definitive, I think, is asking for trouble. Now they know it's a battle site of some date, probably between the Augustus and Tiberius period, so that gives them some leeway, and clearly there was something awful that happened there. But now they're taking a much bigger approach to it, which leaves the opportunity for other places in that part of Germany to say, actually, we are the Teutoburg. But the trouble is there's so much...
That never went away.
No, but my point is that there's so much brand equity of Teutoburg Varus.
Yes, that's true.
Is Osnabrück, and they're not going to easily give that up. So again, what I'm encouraging readers and people watching this podcast is, do your own research. Come to your own conclusions from what we find.
We haven't touched on, in Britain, for instance, King Arthur. and all of the sites around Britain that identify themselves with some bizarre find that is Arthurian. You're like, well, hang on, let's look at the evidence of King Arthur. There's very little, and then you're like, wait, and Roxeter, it's clearly not Avalon. That's the other one. His capital. The name is good. Camelot. That's the word. You're like, no, it's a Roman ruin. Oh, but the post-Roman Britons interpreted this as Camelot. And you're like, what? But again, and Robin Hood. There was a very sensationalized story when Robin's oak was it sycamore?
Sycamore Gap.
It's the Sycamore Gap. Yeah. And it's like associated with Robin Hood. You're like, why is a site on Hadrian's Wall associated with Robin Hood? It's like, what? That's ridiculous. Anyway, but all of those associations are indeed that we're associated with this famous individual, famous place, famous event. It's sensationalized. It becomes ingrained. You get that peculiar thing of the older members of the community remembering. Well, of course, we've always been associated. We're like, have you? I can still remember.
My grandmother used to say.
Exactly. Permeates through, and then it becomes, well, this is history now. And you're like, well, it was never history. It was always mythologizing, and now it's become ingrained to the point you can't eradicate it. So,
well, I think that's why this magazine actually fulfills an important function. So through the ability to be able to tell, for example, you're just talking about a long form article. I don't know what that is or who's written it. But my impression is the fact that we can go back to subjects and inject the latest interpretations and question existing, how can I describe this, orthodoxies about things. And one of the things I'm constantly astonished by, or maybe I shouldn't be anymore, on social media is when somebody posts something. And a lot of the comments are people who are absolutely convinced that they know the answer because they read it in a school textbook years ago, and somehow history is immutable. And I think what certainly I believe this is that really what we're in the quest of trying to do is finding the truth of the past as best we can, fully aware that truth is constantly changing because the witnesses don't always come to the fore, and voices are lost, new finds come from the ground and so forth. And for me, it's an endlessly fascinating quest. It's one that doesn't have an end, actually.
Is that a bombshell? Boom. Mic drop even. In that case, thank you very much. See you again soon.